You'll all have heard the famous quote, Benjamin Franklin, "Nothing is certain except death and taxes." Well, I think tonight Anna is going to be talking about the former, but she may well stray into taxes. Quick introduction. Obviously, this is Anna Wild. She's done an MA in Death, Religion and Culture. Currently doing a PhD in the Death Positive movement. I hope I've got that right. She's a director of CEDAR. I looked up CEDAR and I was saying to Anna, there are lots of things that came up about the trees, but I couldn't actually find cedar, but Anna, I'm sure, will tell you about that. And she's also digital manager for the God's Acre movement, which is about preserving heritage and the environment of burial grounds. So anyway, we're looking forward to a very good talk. So could I ask you to welcome Anna? Thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure to come and talk to you tonight. And yes, so I'm going to talk today, as you know, about weeds, wakes and water and changing funeral traditions. I should say up front, I'm not a death historian as such, but I studied for my master's for 2 years part-time, and now I'm in my 5th year of my PhD part-time. So I've been doing death now for about 7 years, and as I consistently say, my one hope is that I manage to finish the PhD before I die myself, which is growing increasingly unlikely as the years pass, I think. But right, so after getting all of that out of the way, we'll make a start. I should come back to this very lovely engraving in a bit. The French historian Philippe Ariès, his book, The Hour of Our Death, documents what's called a long millennium of the history of death and dying. It starts before 1000 AD, and continues until the date of publication, 1982. And the book is really a history of Christian religious thought and belief throughout the same period, and much of Ariès' writing takes the interlacing of death and religious belief as a given. He starts at an unspecified year, but certainly when Christianity was active, and he splits this block of time into 5 distinct eras. And so they are called the tame death, the death of the self, remote and imminent death, the death of the other, and the hidden death. So we'll go through those as we go along. Starting really with the tame death, an era where people and society expected death constantly. He discusses death in classical myths and legends such as Homer's Odyssey and those in the King Arthur stories. And his principal point is that during this time, people were neither surprised of nor particularly fearful of death, as it was a constant visitor. And it happened frequently, often in public, rather than behind closed doors. And the sights, sounds and smells of the dying and of dead bodies were very familiar to everybody. Death often came quickly, he says, with a fever or an accident killing people within a few hours or days. And the dying person would usually know that there's nothing to be done and therefore accepted his or her fate calmly. It's an interesting point, this, I think, that some years ago, I read my way through the explorer Dervla Murphy's books, and I think there was one, they were set in the sort of 60s and 70s, and she was, I think she was in South America, in the Andes, and visited some villages there, and the people there were explaining to her that since the hospital had been built, which was over the mountain, some days' walk, that since the hospital was there, they felt obliged to carry their dying elders over to the hospital to see if there was something to be done for them, whereas previously they would have made them as comfortable as they could do using, indigenous medicine and the usual care and love. And so I think it's quite an interesting point that when we feel that something might be able to be done, we feel obliged to give it a try, really. And so you can see that where there was nothing to be done, kind of, pre the year 1000, they did just accept that they were going to die, and that was that. And the community, all of the people that they lived with, was on hand and to enact rituals and to ease their passing in any ways that they could do, and also to comfort the bereaved afterwards. The afterlife was viewed as simply a period of waiting, characterised by peace and repose for the Last Judgment, and the return of Christ was expected any day. And the idea of death, this idea of death as an extended sleep, is probably one of the most ancient concepts of death that there is. Not everybody agrees with everything that Arias says. I don't myself, actually, but he's a useful jumping off point, I suppose, for a talk like this, where you can kind of gives a bit of structure, or at least I hope it does. Other social scientists and death studies people, one of whom, Alan Keller here, suggests that actually he was wrong about the quick death, and that often it was a slower process amongst peasant communities with malnutrition and infection being responsible for death in a lot of circumstances. But he makes the point that the description of death as tame relates to the efforts made to keep it domesticated by adhering to things like religious and legal principles, which were familiar to the medieval mind. And Keller here says, to our ancestors, death was a place, really, an otherworld journey that they were moving to, and that keeping that place tame, i.e. domesticated, through customs, moral codes, and above all else, social order, was part of keeping it familiar. So once the tame death evolved into the wild death of modern times, the requirements of domesticating it changed from religious and legal principles into medical and legal observances. And I think, again, we're sort of familiar with what's generally called the secularisation of society, and how things have moved away from those kind of like religious observances. But it's still very interesting that I think at the heart of a lot of our death customs, they are still there. So the tame death was followed by the second of Arias' stages, which was called the death of the self. And he says that the rise of the importance of the individual meant that the self was a separate thing from the community that it previously relied upon. He describes the arising of the concept of the person being split into two things, with the body and the soul was seen as the seat of individuality. The medieval tract Ars Moriendi, The Art of Dying Well, which was published around 1450, became very popular when it came out, and it's discussed by Arias at length, as it falls within the era of the death of the self, his second. His second era there, and. The Ars Moriendi was a pre-Reformation and therefore obviously a Catholic text, and it documented the steps that the dying should undergo to achieve the good death. And suitable acknowledgement of one's sins and repentance was urgently required by the church whilst one was still alive. And so some of these steps can be seen in this illustration, which I hope you can see. Yes, so the dying person lies in bed, there he is, and he's surrounded by the saints and angels behind him. So if you look at the sort of headboard of the bed there, you can see that he's the saints and angels are the ones with the halos and wings, pretty obviously, really. But it was very important for the dying person to keep their eyes on the figure of Christ on the cross, and so that always featured very heavily in deathbed scenes. And obviously this is a very big version here, but if there was only a small version available, then that would be held up right in front of them so that they couldn't miss it. The absolute worst thing was to die unshrived, unforgiven for your sins, which you needed to confess to a clergyman and receive absolution for them. And it was important that this happened, as I said, whilst you were still able to do so. That wasn't all. Your will should be written, and your family should attend with any luck, and they will be praying for your soul. But in the foreground here, we can see, in fact, that there's a load of rather dodgy-looking characters, and they are demons and devils, and they are doing battle, basically, with the saints and the angels up here for the soul of the dying person. And you can see here the actual soul is this little figure here, which they called a homunculus in those days. And at the moment, at any rate, it looks like the angels are winning and the devils are just kind of like messing around down below. You do quite often see the soul depicted as an actual thing in these kind of older tracts. So the value of the Ars Moriendi was that for most people, of course, couldn't read in those days, and so it was very important that there were these illustrations where not only were they told in church what would happen, but they could actually visualise for themselves what was going to go on, unless they effectively not just made their peace with God, but did all the legal requirements that went along with it as well. And there was a section in the Ars Moriendi on temptation, and there were 10 of these woodcut slides. So they were obviously, very fixated on the fact that it could all go wrong for you at the last minute, really. Another big difference, really, between the earlier era was that the idea of the judgment of the dead was much more forceful around the time that this was published. Prior to that, the idea was that Christ was coming back imminently, and so we were all looking forward to that. And as I said, the tame death was very much more about kind of like, well, we'll just go to sleep when we die and we wait for Jesus to come back, which will be any time now. But unfortunately, by the time they got to 1400, 400 years past the millennium when he was expected, they decided they'd revise that a bit. And so within the Christian framework, there was this idea of judgment. And so the shift really emphasised the suffering in purgatory, which was a place where the dead go to compensate for the sins that they committed whilst they were living. And it brought into focus the idea of the dying person as a battleground for good and evil. And the need to confess before death meant that the sudden death was the most unwelcome death of all. And so in modern days, as you know, I'm sure we've all said ourselves or heard people say, oh, you know, it'd be nice to just die in your sleep and not know about it. But that would be a very bad thing in around this time, because, you know, you haven't ticked off all the things that you needed to tick off on the box. And also, the presence of your friends and relatives had its own importance. By witnessing the dying person, they were reminded of their own eventual death and contemplated the need to be ever vigilant against their own sin or to suffer the consequences in purgatory. And this puts me in mind the friends and relatives of a story that a friend of mine told me about her mother-in-law, who was perpetually on death's door, and she had a number of grown-up children, and she was quite old by this time, into her 90s, and so usually at least once a month the cry would go out that, you know, mother was going to die, and everybody was sort of called to attend at the deathbed scene. And anyway, one day my friend, who was the daughter-in-law, couldn't make it because she was actually tied up at work and she couldn't get there, and she thought, oh well, you know, it'll just be the usual. And so when she came home at the end of the day, she sort of said, oh, you know, how's your mother? And her husband sort of said, oh, well, you know, it's the usual story, really. You know, we were all gathered round and she was hardly breathing. And then, you know, gradually she opened an eye and asked for a cup of tea. And my friend was like, oh, yeah, I thought that would be the case. But then it had an interesting little coda at the end of it, which was a few days later, she thought, oh, I'll go and see her, you know, go and see her and see how she's doing. And as soon as she was through the door, the mother-in-law said to her, and I noticed you weren't there on Sunday. Which always tickled me to death, really, you know. So, after the person had died, what happened next? Well, following the death was the laying out of the body. And laying out was crucially important for the correct observance of all the other funeral customs. Traditionally, the body would be kept at home for a few days, after which the shrouded corpse or coffin would be carried on the shoulders of the chosen bearers all the way to the church and eventually onto the grave. And in rural areas such as this, there were often coffin routes or corpse roads, or sometimes called likeways, specific paths which might have a flat stone along the many miles that they traversed for the bearers to stop and rest the coffin or the shrouded body on. And this was also the purpose of the lich gate outside the church, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, where the body could rest overnight on a stone slab while the relatives prayed alongside it. So if the laying out had been correctly done, there would be no seepage from the decomposing body in transit to the grave. And so the role of the layer out facilitated decent observance of funeral procedures in days where the corpse was the central figure in the funeral, by which I mean when I say the corpse, I mean very often you know, a shrouded body rather than a coffin. So the eyes were closed and were often held closed with pennies, and the jaw was held up so that the mouth too remains closed. Sometimes it was accomplished by a chin strap, or a Bible or prayer book was propped up against the chin to stop the mouth coming open again after death. And the body is washed, its orifices plugged, limbs straightened, nails trimmed, hair brushed, and in the case of men, the chin shaved. So very intensive preparations, really, when you think, you know, in those days they weren't known for sort of bodily hygiene, and yet, you know, there was a lot of care taken to make sure that the dead person was presented correctly when they arrived on the other side. And laying out was usually, interestingly, the province of women for very, very many years. Women obviously are very much associated with birth, and frequently the midwife was often the layer out as well. And in the picture on the screen there, this is a picture of Mary seen with the body of Christ a few days after his death. And of course, obviously, died on Good Friday, and she and the other women went to the cave where his body lay on the Sunday to anoint him with oil and carry out further purification rites, as obviously these had been a little bit, as you can imagine, hasty, shall we say, on the Friday. So here's an example of a lich gate. There is one in Shropshire I think it's Hope Bagot Church, that's got the actual coffin slab. And you can see there that for people where the church wasn't actually opened for them to have the body on holy premises overnight, they could at least have it in the lich gate on the church grounds. And some of the lich gates had little sort of benches as well at the side of the coffin slab, so that they could sit and pray and watch by the body. And so once the laying out was done, as this quote says, I will read it just in case you can't see it well enough. In Europe's largely Catholic past, the night after death was spent in prayer over the body to help the soul on its journey, and the burial took place after a Requiem Mass the next day. During the service, a priest would go into the graveyard and draw a cross on the ground, and afterwards the body would be carried to that place and 7 prayers would be offered along the way. The corpse would be doused with holy water to keep demons away, and bits of incense and charcoal would be thrown into the grave. The corpse would be aligned with its feet towards the east, and shoes were sometimes left on in case Judgment Day necessitated a lot of walking, which is a nice touch, I thought, you know. So the idea of the feet towards the east was so that when Jesus came back and called the dead from their graves, he would be the first thing they saw as they sat up in their graves. But the thing that she mentions first here, the watching over the dead body at night, otherwise known as the wake, the body must not be left unattended overnight. And this was part of an ecclesiastical effort to ward off diabolical intervention, protecting the body through holy sound, the ringing of bells, the saying of psalms and prayers, and in particular, the prayers called the Office of the Dead. And through the beneficence, I can't say that word, beneficence, of the light from candles, until the deceased could be laid in consecrated ground. That's a quote from Chris Walgar. And so you can see that there was all of this was taken very seriously, and interesting that once the body got as far as the churchyard, it was buried the next day. Which obviously is still a requirement for certain other faiths, such as Muslim and Jewish faith. And in addition to laying out, women were employed as something called searchers during the Black Death plague epidemics in London. Parishes ordered women to view all the corpses and ask about the circumstances of death and report their decisions to the parish councillors, who tallied up parish clerks, not councillors, parish clerks, who tallied up the numbers and distributed the plague certificates in the 16th century, and something called bills of mortality from 1603 onwards. So you can see couple of those there, along with the top image, which is a couple of women searchers pulling the corpses of the plague victims along. Unsurprisingly, it was a job undertaken largely by the poor and elderly women, and of course they died in droves while performing this role. But again, interesting, this idea of women who are very involved in the hands-on kind of part of the death. You know, the church men were the ones who sort of stood back and did all the kind of prayer and fancy stuff. The women were the ones who got stuck in and did all the nasty stuff, or if not nasty, perhaps not as straightforward. Moving on to kind of what happened next after the body was laid to rest. Obviously, there's sort of food and drink at most funerals, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But the sin eaters were an interesting tradition that you hear of, and this particular quote says that they were long, lean, ugly, and lamentable poor rascals. And they ate this special meal, which was often bread and salt, and usually some sort of drink as well, some sort of ale usually. And the idea of this was that it was passed to them over the corpse or over the coffin, depending on where they were. And in the eating of that, they were magically eating the sins of the deceased as well, and they got paid for it, but obviously there was also the downside that you weren't quite sure what eating that many of other people's sins was going to do for your own time when you died. So and very interestingly, this is the grave of Richard Munslow, who was a gentleman farmer of the village of Rattlinghope in Shropshire. And he died in 1906, and he was the last recorded sin eater. So, I mean, that recently, that is amazing, isn't it? My grandparents were sort of born in the early 1890s, and so, you know, to me, that seems like a very recent history. And another factor really with the sin eaters is that they were supposed to prevent the sin-ridden dead from returning to earth in the form of ghosts or spirits. And so they tended to be shunned, as you can imagine, by locals because they were associated with evil spirits and witchcraft. And they were only really summoned when there was a need for their services. Some say that even the wooden platter that was used to serve the food to the sin eater would be burned by superstitious mourners, and to look a sin eater in the eye was held to be extremely bad luck. And so the sin eater's grave that we're looking at here is in the churchyard in Church Stretton, I believe, and there was a lot of money raised not that long ago, can't remember when, to actually sort of do the monument up, and I think it had fallen into quite bad repair, and so you can see there that it was smartened up a bit and put back together. And another little interesting thing is, whilst we're on the subject of food, let's talk about funeral biscuits, because I think this is an absolutely amazing idea. And I've realised actually that the URL on the bottom there is incorrect. It's on the next one, and I think I've put it on both by mistake. So a funeral biscuit was handed out to mourners at a funeral to take home. So it was sort of like a party bag, really. And it would have not just the biscuit, but an appropriate Bible verse sealed up there, as we can see with black wax to, for the occasion. Funeral biscuits tended to be slightly sweetened, and they contained caraway seeds and looked like a cross between a scone and a biscuit, according to some historians. Some families owned an engraved wooden stamp which were only used to impress patterns on funeral biscuits, and they were handed down through generations and were greatly prized. And as I say, I think this should definitely be revived. And that on the right there is obviously a funeral biscuit stamp. So the final star of the food is in England. It was common for soul cakes to be handed out to solars, who were usually children and the poor, who would go from door to door begging for them during All Hallow Tide. So that incorporated All Souls Day and All Saints Day, which was the 1st and 2nd of November. And of course, our festival of Halloween is kind of like being attached to that, really. As they were handed the soul cakes, the souling children would sing and say prayers for the souls of the cake givers and for their deceased relatives and friends. And again, interestingly, although it died out across England, the custom persisted in Shropshire and nearby Staffordshire right up until the 1950s. So I do think that the soul cakes look quite delicious, really, don't they? And in fact, the reason I put that URL on there is because there's a recipe for them. So, you know, if you fancy, I can't give you a recipe for a funeral biscuit, I'm afraid, but if you fancy a soul cake, then that's the way to go. So moving on swiftly, past such fun things, back to Ariès and his third era of death, the remote and imminent death. And within this era, which was roughly the 14th to the 18th century, which is a massive span of time, really, the focus shifts from the deathbed scene, and it's characterised by the loss of intensity that surrounded death previously. And the idea of salvation is slightly altered so the emphasis is on leading a good life all of the time, not just doing right when you're dying. And according to Ariès, this had the effect of making death far more remote, as it was easily forgotten about. And as I said earlier, I don't really agree with a lot of what Ariès says. He's got some very good, interesting stuff in there, but you know, some of his kind of reasoning seems a bit twisted to fit, really. But nonetheless, the idea of this remote death was sort of kind of growing, really, around that time. And of course, there was an awful lot of, as I say, an awful lot of change in a 400-year span. So in the years following the plague, there was a rise in art about death. So this particular picture is part of the genre of danse macabre. And you can see in there the figure with the woman in the yellow dress, that the skeleton there has got his arrow in the one hand ready to plunge it into the woman's back, and his hourglass in the other hand to remind her that her time on earth is limited. And further up, there's another skeleton with the bishop there with his crook, and in a similar way, the whole point of this was to remind the wealthy and those who were in positions of power that they too were going to die. A kind of similar sort of thing was the memento mori, which basically means remember that you'll die. And so again, it was this sort of affirming of the fact that no matter who you were, as you said at the beginning, you know, we're all absolutely certain to die. And so Ariès claims that with the loss of death's vigorous presence, that life too was affected, and the awareness of the brevity of life was highlighted in the earlier centuries, whilst later the rise of scientific inquiry led to a fascination with the cadaver and with dissection as medical knowledge advanced. And burials were removed from within the church, which is currently at this point where most people were buried inside the church, even if it was sort of, you know, in a bit of a forgotten corner. But that moved out into the graveyard then. The poor people were the responsibility of the parish, and so they were buried within the churchyard in earlier times of this 400-year span. But as the years passed, individual graves for the poor were done away with, and they were buried in large pits, all together without individual markings. Obviously, headstones and the like didn't really come into general use until about the sort of 1600s. You do still find some that are a little bit before that, and of course they were only for the very wealthy. This particular grave is a photo I took of a memento mori grave in Cumbria, and as I was in this particular church, which was lovely, I heard somebody say to me, "Oh, that'll be a pirate's grave," which clearly it's not, because there were an awful lot of them in that church as well, so worth looking out for. So the early 1700s saw the rise of two things: growth of the cities and the middle class in particular, that meant that instead of using local laying out women, the handling of the dead started to become commercialised business. And the funeral trade card seen here shows that you can buy a whole assortment of different things to wear to funerals or have at funerals. And criticism of the new trade was rife, particularly from the College of Arms, who had handled funerals for the rich and famous before the funeral trade got started. And so you can see here, I won't read it all because I'm short of times, but I like the particular, the last sentence there: "I know of no one qualification peculiarly necessary to them, except it is a steady, demure and melancholy countenance at command." And this particular image, which is a French engraving of an English funeral, shows a couple of interesting things. At the beginning there, you'll see these people with these poles are called mutes, and they're sort of like a kind of bag tied around some woolly stuff, and the idea was that if somebody had suffered a bereavement, they would stand outside the door, obviously only of the rich and wealthy, to show that the people were bereaved, and then accompanied the funeral procession with the clergy next, and this very interesting looking sort of catafalque here that they've got, where I thought at first there was going to be some horses involved, but I think it's just human legs really, so it looks like there's quite a lot of them carrying this gigantic thing. And then of course the mourners in the coffin, and then going back around the corner, all the rich and famous friends and hangers-on basically. And this kind of funeral trappings started to set the scene for the Victorian funeral and the next of Ariès's death. I'll skip over Burke and Hare because we know about them, most of us. So the fourth era that Ariès addresses, he terms the death of the other. One person is absent and the whole world is empty. So this perhaps starts to become something where we're probably a bit more familiar with this way of thinking, I would say. And but the sorrow of the bereaved is taking centre stage, not the dead person here. And he attributes this to the removal of hell from popular belief, saying that, you know, that wasn't really broadly signed up to anymore, but that obviously heaven was still of interest to many people with religious beliefs, and those who were not religious were often taken by spiritualist type movement, which of course was very large at this time. And the Victorian era was demonstrated this kind of like romanticism of death that Ariès talks about, following the death of Queen Victoria's husband Albert, in 1861, when the Queen's extended mourning created new fashions for grief. And Arias says it's this large societal change around the era again, when instead of death being absorbed by the wider community, the loss became concentrated in the immediate family. Various fashions came to the forefront. Widows followed the lead of Queen Victoria, who wore strict mourning for 2 years after the death of her husband. The widows followed the lead of Queen Victoria and wore strict mourning for 2 years. But in fact, Victoria never wore anything else other than mourning after Albert's death. And interestingly, the mourning veils that they wore were dyed black with chemicals that cause breathing problems, blindness, skin rashes, and even death in some cases. And there was a sort of a gender thing going on here, where if John's brother died, John's wife was expected to wear strict mourning for a year. It was very uncomfortable as well, the crepe that they wore, whilst John merely got away with a black tie and armband for a short period. So unfortunately, it was the poor women who suffered the spots and blindness. I'll skip over that, but just to say various sort of things to do with mourning. Hair brooches, which I expect we've all heard of. The hair brooch there is surrounded by jet, very common in Victorian era for jewellery. And a lovely little example of an in memoriam card which my friend bought in Bridgnorth, which has a really sickly poem in it, which I won't read you because I would have done, but we'll skip it. So the fifth era of death, Arias calls the invisible death, and that includes, when I say modern day, up until the 80s. And society, he claimed, had banished death, driving it into secrecy, and that secrecy being upheld and kept away from even the dying person themselves. The priest at the bedside is replaced by the doctor and discussed as sights and smells for the dying person make the death seem ugly and dirty. Newer ideas around health and hygiene, as well as medical advances, caused the transfer of the dying person to hospital, where they remained. And at this time, Arias claimed that mourning too has disappeared due to societal pressures not to show grief in public. And it's very interesting when you study death, as is on that slide. Something people always say to you is how taboo death is. And in actual fact, it's very interesting because I spoke to somebody in America recently, and she said, it's not death that's taboo, it's grief that's taboo. It's showing your grief in public. People will talk about death, but they won't break down and cry easily in the supermarket, or if they do, they'll feel very uncomfortable. So Arias blamed some of these changes on the two world wars and the enormous death that was seen, and that everybody had suffered loss. And so when it was all over, it was kind of let's get back to normal sort of feel to it. But things are changing. So now home death caring is becoming more common. As it says there, 25% of deaths happen at home. And if you want to, after your person has died, you can keep them at home for as long as you want, not as long as you want, but a couple of days on chilled mats, which can be supplied to you. Things like death cafes, where you can meet others, talk about death and grief, which is usually a facilitated session, and those happen all the time, even in places in South Shropshire and North Herefordshire. There's a rise in death doulas, where these people are trained to help people, support the family, help people who are dying, help them to go through making their wills or making their dying wishes. The grief is recognised as no longer being a linear process. There was this idea put about by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross originally, where, you know, there were these 5 stages of grief, which were never about grief. They were about the grief of a person who was dying, not about the grief that a bereaved person was suffering. But they're still quoted as being about grief. But it's recognised now that that is not appropriate, and funerals are very much individualised. So the type of thing we see, a kind of celebration of life, such as is happening here with doves being released. This idea of grief is interesting, and I think much more accurate. People think that grief slowly gets smaller with time, but in reality it stays the same size, but slowly the rest of your life grows around it. And far from being taboo, this is just a very, very small sample of recent books that have been published about death and dying, even pet loss. And when I say even, I don't mean that in any way to diminish that, but at one time pet loss was seen as something that was much lesser to the death of a human, and nowadays people are recognising that that is just as much of a painful loss to some people as a human that's dying. And also TV programmes like Afterlife, which was Ricky Gervais, whose wife had recently died, and the series is about how he sort of copes with that. So, just to leave you with a little thought here, when you were born, you cried and the world rejoiced. Live your life in a manner so that when you die, the world cries and that you rejoice. And that's the end. So, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.